Self-evaluations can be, usually I have found that they have a really elevated thought of themselves and the value that they bring, or they're extremely hard on themselves. And maybe they don't see what you see in them. But it can really be insightful to see where they're at with their perception of their performance, meeting goals, behaviors, and getting along with coworkers. So for new leaders, I really suggest self-appraisals so that you know what the employee thinks before you schedule that time with them.
Welcome to Culture Change RX, the podcast for healthcare professionals that are committed to creating a thriving workplace culture, improving the experiences of employees and patients, and ultimately unlocking their organization's next level of potential. I'm Sue Tetzloff, your host and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. Join me and my insightful guests each week as we share actionable insights for navigating the crucial people side of the business of healthcare. Subscribe now for a weekly dose of Culture Change RX. Now let's dive into this week's conversation where culture change takes center stage. Welcome back to another episode of Culture Change RX. And I have with me today one of our transformational coaches. It is Julie Coneset, and she comes with a background that is very heavy in HR world. So she is a great one to be a guest today on the topic of annual evaluations or performance appraisals. It is a topic that is part of our feedback content when we work with leaders on 9 core leadership practices and entire leadership teams on the topics of giving and receiving feedback. We break that down into 2 areas, both formal feedback and informal feedback. So this topic today is going to be on the topic of formal feedback, and in particular, the component of it that would be an annual evaluation or performance appraisal. So we've had a lot of our partner organizations getting ready for the end of the year, and evaluations, they're not all timed that way, but it seems like we've been having these conversations lately of working with organizations on improving this process, or with leaders getting them ready to execute on their process very well of giving feedback to employees through a formal feedback system. So that is our focus today, and my guest is Julie, and I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself for those of you that haven't met her yet on the podcast or otherwise, and then we are going to dive into performance appraisals. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks, Sue. My name's Julie Coneset. I'm a Capstone transformational coach. I have over 30 years of rural healthcare experience. I started in our local hospital in the registration department, and after a year, there was a full-time position open in human resources, and I thought, full-time, why not? And so I took that position, and ultimately that's where I found my love for rural healthcare and human resources. So I had over 27 years in that department, and I loved being able to take care of the employees so that they could take care of our patients and be able to give back to my local community in that way. Throughout my time in the Human Resources Department, performance appraisals were very much a part of my day-to-day, whether it be coaching managers on giving the performance appraisals, making sure that they were completed in a timely manner within our organization guidelines, and entering those into a system that we used to conduct our performance appraisals, random audits, making sure that there was consistency and that compliance piece from a human resources aspect, but really just the feedback and making sure that they were a valuable tool for our employees and that our leaders were comfortable.
You know, you mentioned right there that it's a valuable tool, and in Capstone world, we talk often about how there's 3 buckets of how leaders spend their time. One is in the whirlwind, dealing with day-to-day issues of operations with our people and our patients and our processes and all of that. And then there's the management piece, which there's management tasks like, ordering supplies and putting out schedules and doing things like that. And then there's things that we call leadership practices or tactics. And sometimes I see that people, managers, leaders can sometimes consider annual appraisals as really being one of those management tasks. And we like to shift the mindset that really it's a leadership practice or a tactic that's really about proactive, positive, results oriented leader actions, that it's a way to elevate behaviors and performance. So it's not a task to get off your to-do list, to quickly rush through and get done, that we really should make these meaningful practices and tactics that have a real valuable. So I'd actually like to start there, Julie, is in all of your years of helping organizations develop great practices and tools and training and timing of these annual evaluations. What are some of those amazing tips and tricks that can take something that might seem like a task just to rush through and get through off your to-do list and turn it into something that really is valuable for both the employee and the leader?
Well, and as leaders, we're busy people and we have a lot on our plate. And you talked about the 3 buckets, and we talked with the 9 core leadership practices for it's not necessarily more work, but a different way in which we work. And I think planning is a big thing. And we see this at varying degrees with actually not only just scheduling time with the employee and getting that on the calendar, but putting thoughtful time into preparing for the appraisal and asking yourself, what do I want to accomplish? So kind of begin with the end in mind, right? What do I want the outcome of this conversation to be? Performance appraisals are meant to be a tool to guide the employees to strive to do better and recognize them for the accomplishments and goals which they've achieved, right? So there's a purpose for a performance conversation at the evaluation, right? We're giving them feedback on their performance, because what gets rewarded and recognized gets repeated. And that's what we want. We constantly want them to strive and be better. So I think the first thing is to have planning time on your calendar for these performance appraisals, because otherwise the value is diminished and it can be almost demeaning. For example, we had one leader that was knocking on the door because they couldn't get into the performance evaluation system and their employee was going to be there in 10 minutes. They hadn't signed in to even put the scores in and look at the results and be able to put that thoughtful feedback. And so that was not going to be a good experience, right? It's just rushed, right? So thoughtful planning and consideration for the time and asking, what is it that I want to accomplish?
That's so important. This is one-on-one time, and it's in person, ideally in person. I mean, in this remote work environment and, world, sometimes they are done virtually or whatever, but they're usually done at least with cameras on or over Zoom or something. But they do say that one-on-one face-to-face is the most powerful human interaction. And so now somebody's performance and the relationship between the employee and the leader is all on the table in this time together. And so making sure that we're prepared for that and we're not just winging it just seems to be a really important recommendation to not only know, but to follow, is that it is a high stakes situation. Really, if you want to think about it, it's a big deal.
And being free of distractions, right? So, and what I mean by that is be 100% present. Don't have your cell phone on the desk. Don't be lifting it up and looking at it. If you are remote, that eye contact, so much in communication is based on body language and tone and inflection. And if you just send someone their appraisal, even if it's great, you're really missing an opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to have a win with that employee. And thinking about the overall plan of your department. So let's talk about succession planning for just a second. When you're taking this investment of time for that one-on-one meeting with the employee, and you're looking at, as a leader of a department, I'm responsible for the succession planning and having that conversation. I like to think of like a flight risk assessment of my staff and kind of having an idea what kind of a depth to my bench I have. I could have a really great clinician, but that doesn't mean that they would make a great leader or want to be a leader. So having those conversations about their career goals and where would they like that to see. So that's another piece, free of distractions, so that you can have that one-on-one And we've seen that before where leaders are in a hurry. There's a deadline for when these performance appraisals need to be done. So they just fire them all off in an email. And then they're following up with signatures, but there's never been a conversation. So there's that missed opportunity. So don't miss out on that opportunity to have those conversations.
That's such a good point, Julie. And you mentioned the kind of things that could be folded into this conversation, like almost like a state interview, that flight risk. You could have that kind of conversation. You could do some assessment around that, some conversing around that, talking about succession planning and or future career goals and whatever. And a lot of times we feel like when I was a leader and I had employees, it was my organization that provided the tool or the format and the timeline and everything for the process of me evaluating my employees or me being evaluated even by my boss. So a lot of that appears to be driven by the organization. And I remember working in some organizations that had some really ugly tools. Like, I'm like, wow, what am I supposed to do with this as a leader? You know, what my stance was, and I don't know what you'd say from my HR perspective, but what my stance has always been on this, Julie, is that at a bare minimum, I have to comply with the tool and the policy of my organization for how I evaluate my employee and the timeline in which I do it, et cetera. It's really up to me to make that extremely valuable. And if I want to go above and beyond and make this a more powerful, meaningful conversation to include things like, let's say it doesn't include these things that you're talking about, nobody says I can't do that, right? Like I could like go above and beyond in this process and not just do the bare bones minimum, comply with my organization's requirements, even if it's kind of an ugly tool, and make it better and really make this useful time and valuable time.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I found when I was thinking about performance appraisals and all the best practices that I've seen over the years was one suggestion to send questions ahead of time. So similar to like we do with rounding, and the question being 4 questions that I want my employees to think about prior to their one-on-one meeting with me. So just ask, kind of thought-provoking, right? What has gone well for you this year? Right? This is an opportunity for us to assess whether or not they are aware of their strengths. They can bring those. It kind of turns this evaluation into a more of a dialogue, a one-on-one conversation where they have just as much contribution as you do, going over goals, objectives, and your view on their performance and their, relationships with employees, their coworkers. Ask them what didn't go as well as you wanted this year, getting a feel for what they perceive their weaknesses to be. And then looking ahead at next year, what do they feel is most important? What are their big rocks? So it's an opportunity to have a conversation of how that aligns with the organization goals and your department goals and be able to support them and ask, what do you need from me to be able to achieve those results and continue to grow, right? So what can I do to support you? And that's where you can kind of build in that succession planning. What do you see yourself doing in 5 years? What do you want out of this position here? Are you content? Do you want to be the next CEO of the organization? So it just creates more of a conversation and really valuable dialogue and an investment in the employee so that they leave there feeling fulfilled. Even if they didn't meet all of their goals, you're having a healthy conversation as to maybe why and what could be done differently to set them up for success.
I like the idea of sending them questions in advance. I know that some organizations have a self-evaluation process where the same tool that the leader fills out, the employee fills out, or some sort of format. But I like the idea that it's more conversational and it's more some questions to be talked about and some dialogue to be had. I like that a lot. Most of my time in a healthcare organization was a leader of leaders. So I often was mentoring and coaching frontline leaders as they learn to do this process, whether they're a new leader or experienced leader. And I know some of the things maybe I didn't know so much to tell them what to do, but I know there's a few things that I would always remind them what not to do in this process. One of them was really to make sure that they didn't overrate their employees. What I mean by that is a lot of times they also want to avoid the difficult conversations and the feedback that might not be positive, right? They want to like avoid the pain of all of this, the time and energy of all this. And so it's so easy, I guess it's the easy button to just, let's say your organization, this was actually a tool that existed in an organization where I worked there. There was over 100 criteria of, subjective criteria of a great employee. And we had to rate our employees on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the lowest, 6 being the highest. Well, it was really easy for a leader to just go through and mark a straight line down the 6 column or 5 and 6 column and not really have any meaningful conversations around any of these things. And, I had a whole department that reported to me that was low performing. It had a toxic culture, high turnover, quality error problems, financial problems. I mean, like every way you could rate this department, it was a low performing department. Yet every employee in there was rated a 5 or 6. Well, that just can't be, right? That every employee is performing at a top level, behaving and performing at a top level, yet the department is underperforming at a very bad level, right? That can't be the reality of it, right? They were overrated. The employees were being overrated by their leader. So to your point earlier, what gets rewarded and recognized gets repeated. So those 5s and 6s were rewarding and recognizing poor behavior and poor performance and poor outcomes in a department. And so why were they not getting better? Right? Because there was no meaningful conversations or honest feedback about where individuals and collectively everyone was behaving and performing. So when I had that like extreme example of an entire department, every employee in it being overrated, it became advice that I gave all leaders is don't hit the easy button and give feedback that's overrating people, or you're basically reinforcing that level of behavior performance and the results that are on the other end of that. So I don't know, that's my what not to do, one of them anyway. Maybe you can counter that with a what to do, another what to do.
Well, that was actually one of my responsibilities in our organization. When the evaluations came in, I had to review them all to make sure that there was consistency, to make sure that if you scored above or below, this was our response to that situation that you're referring to. If you scored above or below a 3, 4, like if you gave them a 5, 6, or a 1, 2, you had to have a justification.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that middle score was okay, right? But if it was above or below, you had to have a justification. So there had to be some education for the people doing the performance appraisals. And I think from an HR standpoint, that's key. Your HR department has to train for expectations and not just expect that people know how to give a performance appraisal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at a leadership development training, spend some time. We're coming into performance evaluations season. Here's what not to do. Here are a few tips and tricks that you could do, and really give them the tools and equipment they need to be able to do a really good performance appraisal. Because across the board in an organization, there was a period of time when our organization did pay for performance. We ran into that same thing. Nobody wants to have the bad conversation. Jackie's a really nice person, and I know that she's a single mom, and so, I'm going to give her 5s and 6s because I want her to get a good raise. That's the issue with that whole subjective feedback, right? When you can't back it up with actual goals, metrics, or data.
Well, that brings up the point actually about that example I gave about that entire department, the leader over evaluating every employee, because the results in that department were not showing top level performance by employees, or the results would not be what they were. But that was in a situation of pay for performance. So not only were they getting the high evaluation scores, they were getting high raises as well. And again, their department was extremely underperforming. I remember patient satisfaction in that department being in the bottom 1% of the country. So when I'm talking, I'm not exaggerating here, like the data was there to show. And so I think that also brings up the point, Julie, that if I were to bring in honest feedback, which I should, into this really important annual formal conversation and evaluation processes, none of that should be a surprise anyway. If I'm really trained and consistent in giving good informal feedback in the moment, day to day as a leader, and I'm giving them feedback, calling them out when they're outside of standard, praising them when they're inside or above and beyond standard. Like when that's happening all the time, I think that takes a lot of heat off the annual evaluation conversation as far as any level of uncomfortableness around behavior performance that's below standard, because it's a no surprises situation. Like this is just a synopsis. This is a summary of all those conversations we've had all year round about what's been going well and what's been being worked on to make better. And that this is just that formality of documenting it, looking back to last year and getting ready for next year. And it really takes some of the heat or pressure off and allows us to maybe have some more valuable conversations around things like career planning, where do you want to go next? How can I help you grow and develop? Those kind of things. Even if it's a lot of difficult conversation, it's not negative. It's all helpful.
One of the things that I wanted to mention was a tip for new leaders. So new leaders giving performance appraisals for the first time. I know you had mentioned earlier, some organizations do self-evals, and you may or may not get the self-eval back from the employee, depending on what system you use. Self-evaluations can be, usually I have found that they have a really elevated thought of themselves and the value that they bring, or they're extremely hard on themselves. And maybe they don't see what you see in them. But it can really be insightful to see where they're at with their perception of their performance, meeting goals, behaviors, and getting along with coworkers. So for new leaders, I really, really suggest self-appraisals so that you know what the employee thinks before you schedule that time with them. You can look at the performance appraisal that was done in the past. You can look at where the employee thinks that they are, and then you can give your feedback as to what you know so far, right? Based on that. And that's why it's helpful when you do have those performance appraisals that are linked to goals and results and metrics, right? Because that's not subjective. But I think it is a really great window to see what they're thinking, right? Some of the things that they've accomplished. Maybe there are trainings that they went to, and you came into the organization the last 3 months. And so you're having to give a performance appraisal on someone and you've only been in that role for 3 months. Or let's say you were their coworker and you were promoted. Wow. So there's some power in that too. Because as a coworker, we see a lot. I remember a time in my career I was in an interim role and it was time to do performance appraisals. And I had this weight on my shoulders of there was one coworker in particular that had some performance issues. And I thought to myself, okay, Julie, I can identify these performance issues and put them on this performance appraisal. It's going to be really uncomfortable. Or I can just score her high like it's been done in the past and we'll just move on till the new person gets there. But the problem with that is the new leader that was coming into the department was going to look at my assessment of her performance, and then I was going to be perceived as ineffective. So I had this challenge, right? And so I had to do it in such a way that I was trying to give her constructive coaching from a leadership aspect, but yet I was still her coworker. So that was challenging, but it was good for me in that growth as a leader.
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
faced with
That
that.
brings up such a good point about being an interim leader or a new leader. I know one of the things we recommend for new leaders is get to know your people, their behavior, their performance as fast as you can. Form relationships with them and rounding so you can get that rapport for giving them feedback, even if it's a call out or constructive.
Well, and it's a gift. This is a gift
Mm-hmm.
that you're giving someone. And so you mentioned the performance evaluation is essentially a summary of all of those conversations that you've had along the way. And so if you've been constantly coaching someone and you've identified, because from a human resources aspect, if you come into my office and you say, I need to write up or I need to terminate Steve,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you, what conversations have you had with him? Like
Mm-hmm.
what have we laid the groundwork? What work has been done to try to bring this to his attention that this needs to change? So from an HR standpoint, when you do these performance appraisals and you do them well, nobody enjoys having to terminate employment. Nobody
Mm-mm.
enjoys that. It's uncomfortable. We feel bad. But at the end of the day, if you as a leader have done these things really well, if you've coached them in between their performance appraisal and you've done a well-documented performance appraisal, then you know that you've done everything you possibly could to try to set them up for success and
Mm-hmm.
encourage a change.
Well, in our approach and in our feedback system of both formal and informal feedback, beyond annual evaluations, we have a coaching model and then we also have a 5-point correction model. And you use that when you need it, right? Especially the 5-point correction. You don't hold this feedback until the evaluation and then kitchen sink it and bring it all out there. The daily feedback gives you constructive feedback all along the way. But if that's not working to elevate the behavior performance, there's other formal feedback tools like a corrective conversation that we find to be very effective that really helps to get people hopefully on the right path of improving their behavior performance. So at the annual evaluation, even if I had a 5-point correction conversation with an employee 3 months ago because of a chronic persistent behavior performance issue, and we're on this pathway of improving that, when I get to the annual evaluation, I'm giving an update about where we're at. I'm not starting over. We're just at this point, and now we're having this next conversation. So the annual evaluation, while it is a big, important conversation, we don't have to wait to have the
No.
conversation if we have a performance issue. And there's a couple other options, a few other options that we have. And that's why we love our friends in HR. We love the training that leaders get along the way because, this conversation, while important, doesn't have to carry all of the weight of improving individual behavior performance or recognizing it.
No, it's just a piece of it. Well, it's a big piece, it's just a
Mm-hmm.
piece. And like we've said throughout this, it's a summary. It's a summary of those
Mm-hmm.
conversations that we've had. I just know as a leader that sometimes we take that on ourselves and feel like we should have done something different. But if we take advantage of, like you said, the 5-point conversation and the coaching conversations along the way, if we do those and we do those well, the behavior changes.
This got me thinking about Courtney, one of our other coaches. We did an episode not too long ago on high performers and giving feedback to high performers. And it made me think of that with annual evaluations of very high performing, high behaving employees is that I feel like we still need to embrace this idea that no matter how great each person is and their behavior performance, they can always go up. And they're really driven to go up and they want people to help them go up because that's how they're wired. And I find though that when I get into that situation and I even will phrase it this way or tee it up this way where I'll say, I know and you know this high level of behavior performance and where you are, but my job and your desire is to keep going higher. So now we're at the point of it might seem nitpicky, right? That some of the stuff that might help you get to the next level seems very nitpicky, but that's all that's left. So those are also equally hard, I think, to make them meaningful and purposeful is when people are already very, very good.
Absolutely. And it can be uncomfortable for them as well. I never enjoyed performance appraisals. I remember one time our HR director had sent me an invite, and our offices were right next to each other. She had sent me a calendar invite for the performance appraisal, and I declined it. And she said, "Oh, Julie." And I said, "Just email it to me, right? Just send it along." And she was like, "You know better than that." And I'm like, it's always so uncomfortable.
It's good to be on the receiving end, right, Julie, of the things that you're teaching others to do and
Yes,
the advice you're promoting. And yeah, it's almost like us as nurses, when we're patients, we learn a lot when we're on the
absolutely.
receiving end. So, well, Julie, this episode already, we're here at the usual 30 plus minute mark and want to wrap it up. I do know that we could have a whole nother conversation around organizational thinking and tools and training and timing and process, pay for performance or not. I mean, like, there's a lot of things we could talk about, and maybe save that for another episode. But I love the idea that today we had such a rich conversation about some of the tips of what to do and not to do as an individual leader when we're preparing for and giving evaluations. Is there any last pointers or tips before we wrap up that you wanted to make sure that we brought out in this episode?
I don't think so. I think that's everything that I wanted to make sure that we, touched on today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Julie, for the work that you've done for decades now to help rural healthcare organizations in their people processes. You certainly are an expert in that world, and we're so glad to have you in our coaching corner with our partners and the work they're doing to elevate their organizations and the behavior performance of their people and their systems around that. So thank you, Julie, for your time today.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Culture Change RX. If you found value in today's episode and you are a believer in fostering change in healthcare, join us in making a difference. Follow, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. Share it with colleagues and your network. Together, we can make a lasting impact. Until next week, keep inspiring positive change.